America sells fighters, but some allies get the keys. Others get a locked box. One country built its own F-15. Another rewrote the F-35. Same playbook, different rules. Why can't Japan sell its own fighters? Why does Israel get the only unlocked F-35? The answer is in the playbook.
The American F-Series fighter lineage represents one of the most dominant bloodlines in military aviation history, stretching from the early Cold War Century Series to the fifth-generation F-35 Lightning II. The Century Series fighters of the 1950s, including the F-100 Super Sabre, F-101 Voodoo, F-102 Delta Dagger, F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunderchief, and F-106 Delta Dart, were defined by their pursuit of speed and altitude, with aircraft like the F-104 earning the nickname the missile with a man in it for its extreme performance. These were followed by the legendary F-4 Phantom II, a third-generation heavyweight that became the most widely exported American fighter, with over 5,000 built and service in more than 15 air forces. The F-5 Tiger, designed specifically as a low-cost export fighter, proved that the United States was willing to share its technology to build Allied air power around the globe. The fourth generation brought a revolution in air combat capability with the F-14 Tomcat, F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and F-A-18 Hornet, each introducing fly-by-wire controls, advanced pulse Doppler radars, and multi-role flexibility that redefined what a fighter could do. The F-15 Eagle, with its famous motto, "Not a pound for air-to-ground," established absolute air superiority with reportedly over 100 aerial kills and 0 losses in combat. The F-16 Fighting Falcon became the most produced Western fighter, with more than 4,600 built and 25 operators worldwide. The F-15E Strike Eagle and F/A-18EF Super Hornet represented the 4.5 generation evolution, adding AESA radars, advanced electronic warfare suites, and precision strike capabilities that bridged the gap to the fifth generation. The fifth generation arrived with the F-22 Raptor in 1997, a stealth air dominance fighter with supercruise and sensor fusion that was so sensitive that the United States Congress banned its export entirely. The F-35 Lightning II, which first flew in 2006, was designed from the start as a global partnership program with 3 variants serving the U.S. Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy, as well as allied nations around the world. What makes the F-35 truly revolutionary is not just its stealth or its F-135 engine, but its architecture as a flying supercomputer, with more than 8 million lines of code and sensor fusion that creates a single, integrated picture of the battle space. However, as we will explore, the degree to which the United States allows its allies to modify, maintain, and control these fighters varies enormously across generations and countries. Japan F-15J represents one of the most extensive foreign modifications of any American fighter, and the story begins with what the United States refused to give when Japan licensed the F-15C from McDonnell Douglas in 1978. The U.S. was unwilling to transfer certain sensitive technologies, so Japan developed indigenous replacements, including the J-APR-4 radar warning receiver and the JALQ-8 electronic countermeasure systems. This meant that the F-15J, outwardly identical to the American F-15C, was running on an entirely separate Japanese electronic architecture, American in airframe, but Japanese in electronic soul. The detailed implementation and future evolution of this system were controlled by Japanese industry through Mitsubishi Heavy Industries rather than by the U.S. The operational consequences of this technology gap were most acute in the realm of data links, where early F-15Js faced significant limitations. The standard USAF F-15C used Link 16, the tactical data link that allowed real-time sharing of targeting information with AWACS, Allied fighters, and naval assets. Early F-15Js were equipped with an indigenous data link that functioned primarily with Japan ground-controlled intercept network, and this link was not compatible with Link 16. This meant that Japan frontline fighter could not fully participate in the network-centric warfare that defined American and NATO operations. However, this limitation was not universal across the fleet. Japan has already upgraded many MSIP F-15J with Link 16 data links, and through the JAJ Air Defense Network, tactical information can be shared with Link 16 equipped aircraft. The impact of this limitation was compounded by the fact that not all F-15Js received the same upgrades, with older pre-MSIP aircraft lacking the wiring and computing capacity for full Link 16 integration. The comprehensive solution arrived with the Japan Super Interceptor program announced in February 2022, which will equip 68 F-15J with new AESA radars, advanced electronic warfare systems, and high-speed computing derived from the F-15EX. The original plan had targeted 98 aircraft, but budget constraints ultimately locked the final fleet at 68 highly modernized jets, with the remainder of the aging pre-MSIP fleet scheduled for gradual retirement and replacement by F-35. The missile compatibility story of the F-50J is equally fascinating and reveals a pattern of Japanese self-reliance driven by American technology restrictions. While the USAF F-15C evolved from the AIM-7 Sparrow to the AIM-120 AMRAAM as its primary beyond visual range missile, Japan developed its own active radar homing missile, the Mitsubishi AAM-4, which entered service in 1999. The AAM-4B variant, equipped with an AESA seeker, was one of the first operational air-to-air missiles in the world to feature this advanced technology, and open sources generally attribute a longer engagement range than early AIM-120 variants. The AAM-4 has a reported maximum range of 120 kilometers and weighs approximately 230 kilograms, with dimensions that differ from the AMRAAM. Older, unmodernized F-15J were left carrying the legacy semi-active AIM-7 Sparrow for beyond visual range combat, while the upgraded JMS IP fleet received the indigenous AAM-4 alongside limited compatibility with American AIM-120s. The F-50J missile story reveals that Japan's solution was not simply to adopt American weapons, but to build its own, creating a unique capability that was optimized for its specific defense needs. The F-50J missile story reveals that Japan's solution was not simply to adopt American weapons, but to build its own, creating a unique capability that was optimized for its specific defense needs. That self-reliance worked for deterrence, but it left Japan with a fleet it could not move anywhere else. That problem surfaced as early as the late 2010. By the end of 2010, as Japan was drafting its new National Defense Program guidelines and looking at the cost of the FX replacement, the Ministry of Defense quietly explored what to do with its oldest F-15J and F-15DJ airframes. The idea was on the table to offer refurbished J and DJ models, including the two-seat DJ trainers, as affordable air superiority fighters for partners in Southeast Asia. To understand why that idea died, you have to look at the timeline. In 2014, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe relaxed the self-imposed ban on exporting lethal weapons, a sign that Japan was breaking with principles it had followed since the 1950s. At the same time, the Air Self-Defense Force was facing a new reality. China was flying J-20, North Korea was testing missiles, and half of Japan 200 F-15J were still pre-MS IP jets with no Link 16 and no modern computer. The 2018 National Defense Program guidelines made the call: buy 105 more F-35 on top of the 42 already ordered and find a way to deal with the old Eagles. That plan became concrete in the early 2020. The answer was the Japan Super Interceptor program. The original plan in 2019 was to modernize 98 F-15J with AESA radar and F-15EX technology. But budget pressure cut that number to 68 jets by February 2022, with the rest slated for retirement. That is when the late 2010 idea came back: what do we do with dozens of J and DJ airframes that still have flight hours left? On paper, they were perfect for export. In reality, they were legally unsellable. Here is what most defense analysts miss. They will tell you the F-15J is different from the F-15C because it has a APR-4 and J ALQ-8 and stop there. They never explain the legal trap behind that difference. Because the F-15J and F-15DJ were built under a U.S. license, Japan does not own the right to resell them. Under ITAR, it is unlawful to re-export or retransfer any defense article without a license or written approval from the U.S. So, when Japan retired dozens of pre-MS IP, F-15J and DJ jets to make room for the F-35, it could not sell them to the Philippines, Indonesia, or Ukraine, even though there was interest. The jets could only be scrapped for parts or returned to the United States. This is why the export story matters more than the spec sheet. Japan was allowed to build and modify its own electronic soul, but it was never given the key to sell it. Then, Japan also have F-16, or more accurately, the F-2 that they build domestically. The Mitsubishi F-2 is a multi-role fighter derived from the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon and manufactured by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Lockheed Martin. For the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, with the airframe enlarged, heavily composited, and nicknamed Viper Zero. It entered history as the first fighter to field an active electronically scanned array radar, the JAPG-1, introduced on the Mitsubishi F-2 in 1995. While the F-15J and F-15DJ were built for air superiority, the F-2 was built as Japan's primary anti-invasion spear. Its core doctrine is maritime strike, to sink enemy landing fleets before they reach the main islands. For that, it carries up to 4 indigenous anti-ship missiles from the Type 80 SM-1 and Type 93 SM-2 to the supersonic ASM-3 and ASM-3 Akai that flies above Mach 3. That combination of a large wing for long-range and heavy anti-ship ordnance is what makes the F-2 different from any standard F-16. But the F-2 proves the same export trap as the F-15J and F-15DJ that Japan tried to sell since the late 2010s. Despite the Japanese built-wing radar and missiles, the F-110 engine, flight control software, and baseline design remain under U.S. license and ITAR control. Japan cannot sell the F-2 abroad without written U.S. approval, just as it cannot sell its retired Eagles. After 2 generations of trying to build autonomy through licensed production, the result was identical. Japan was allowed to build and modify its own electronic soul, but it was never given the key to sell it. The F-35 represents the most tightly controlled fighter aircraft in history, with every line of code, every radar frequency, and every electronic warfare parameter classified at the highest levels. Yet Israel F-35I Adir stands as the single exception to this global lockdown. Every other F-35 operator in the world flies the standard BAE Systems AN/ASIC 239 electronic warfare suite, a system that provides 360-degree detection, greater ranges and signal fidelity, and advanced countermeasures. Israel, however, was granted unprecedented permission to modify this architecture with Elbit systems, providing an indigenous electronic warfare suite that supplements the standard AN/ASIC 239 through approved interfaces. This is not a replacement of the core BAE built hardware, but rather an added layer of Israeli capability that operates alongside the protected U.S. core architecture tailored specifically to counter the air defense systems that Israel faces in its region. The Israeli modifications go beyond electronic warfare to encompass the entire command and control architecture of the aircraft. The F-35I features a reconfigured mission computer that allows integration of Israeli C-4I systems, connecting the fighter directly to Israeli satellites and battlefield networks in ways that no other F-35 operator can replicate. This transforms the F-35I from a stealth strike fighter into a central sensor and C-4I node capable of directing entire campaigns while maintaining its own offensive and defensive capabilities. Israel has also integrated its own weapons, including the Python 5 air-to-air missile and Spice precision-guided bombs, with these weapons now reported as operational on the F-350I. The Python 5 and Spice are carried internally to maintain the aircraft full stealth configuration. What makes Israel Exception truly unique is the AS-15 test aircraft, the only F-35 test bed operating outside the United States. This one-of-a-kind aircraft, with construction number AS-15 and Israeli serial 924, was delivered to the Israeli Air Force Flight Testing Center at Tel Naf Air Base on November 11, 2020. It was built in early 2020 and initially tested at a U.S. airfield before its transfer to Israel. It serves as a dedicated flying laboratory for every Israeli enhancement to the F-35, from software updates and weapon integration to threat-specific jamming and communications systems, with a focus on munitions, advanced operating systems, and signal collection capabilities. The existence of this test bed means that Israel can develop, test, and field modifications to its F-35 fleet without waiting for the Joint Program Office centralized development cycle, a capability that no other nation possesses. Israel was also the first country to operate the F-35 in combat, beginning in 2018, demonstrating that the combination of American stealth and Israeli customization creates a platform of unmatched operational flexibility. Before we compare Japan and Israel, we have to understand why the United States treats stealth technology as almost sacred. The strategic rationale is simple. Stealth is not just a feature, it is a long-term source of military advantage that the U.S. protects by law. Exporting a stealth aircraft means exposing its airframe shaping, radar-absorbent coatings, and maintenance methods to foreign eyes, creating a risk of reverse engineering or exploitation by adversaries. Even if the aircraft itself is never copied, foreign access can help enemies refine their detection and engagement methods against U.S. forces. That logic is strongest for the F-22 Raptor, which is banned from export by the 1998 Obey Amendment, a legal barrier that is even tighter than ITAR itself. But the F-35 is different. It was built from the start as a multinational program, so the U.S. had to find a way to share it without giving away the crown jewels. The solution was identical hardware for every F-35 in the world, but controlled data on top of it. Export F-35 used the same core sensor fusion engine as U.S. jets, where data from the APG-81 AESA radar, the electro-optical targeting system, and the distributed aperture system is fused into one coherent picture. However, what threats the jet can recognize in that picture is determined by mission data files, which are essentially classified threat libraries. For almost every operator, those libraries are built and updated inside the U.S. reprogramming enterprise and cannot be edited locally. What weapons can be integrated and what data links like MADL and Link 16 can fully exploit also depend entirely on U.S. export decisions and bilateral agreements. This is why the Israeli exception is so unique. They are not getting a downgraded jet. They are getting their own reprogramming lab at Nevatim to build their own threat libraries, and that is something no other F-35 operator in the world has. The contrast between Japan F-15J and Israel F-35I reveals a fundamental spectrum of American export control philosophy that has evolved dramatically over 5 decades. Japan modifications were born of necessity. The United States refused to transfer certain critical technologies, so Japan built its own equivalents, creating an aircraft that was American in airframe, but Japanese in electronic soul. Israel modifications, by contrast, were born of permission. The United States granted unprecedented access to the F-35 architecture because of Israel Qualitative Military Edge status, a legal mandate enshrined in U.S. law that requires maintaining Israel military superiority over its regional neighbors. This distinction is crucial because it explains why the F-35I remains the only F-35 variant with sovereign modification rights, while even close NATO allies must operate within the constraints of the Joint Program Office centralized control. The intermediate position on this spectrum is occupied by fighters like the South Korean F-15K Slam Eagle and the Israeli F-16I Sufa, which represent the transition era of export control. The F-15K, for example, integrates indigenous electronic warfare systems and carries the German-made Taurus KEPD 350 cruise missile, giving South Korea a long-range strike capability with reduced dependence on American supply chains. The F-16I Sufa represents perhaps the peak of 4th-generation modification freedom, with approximately 50% of its avionics replaced by Israeli systems, including conformal fuel tanks, an Elbit helmet-mounted display, and Israeli weapons like the Python 5 and Spice. Yet even the F-16I remains a 4.5-generation fighter with more permissive export rules than the 5th-generation F-35, where the software is the weapon and the code is the crown jewel. The 5th generation has fundamentally changed the calculus of American fighter exports because the F-35 is not just an aircraft but a networked weapons system whose value depends on the integrity of its software and sensor fusion. Allowing any foreign nation to modify the F-35 core code would risk compromising the entire global fleet, including the U.S. military-owned aircraft, because the F-35 shares data and tactics across the network. This is why every F-35 operator except Israel must use U.S.-controlled or regionally approved depots for heavy maintenance, and why threat libraries are updated through a centralized Joint Program Office process, and why non-U.S. weapons integration requires years of bilateral negotiation. The F-35I Adir is not a precedent for future exports, but a unique exception driven by a strategic relationship that is literally written into American law. The story of the F-15J and the F-35I reveals how American fighter exports evolved from selling aircraft to selling access in the 4th generation. Allies bought fighters and customized them to fit national doctrine, but in the 5th generation, allies increasingly buy membership in an ecosystem whose rules are written in Washington.